Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I've been working as a ranger for about 7 years now, and I can say with confidence that there's not much that surprises me anymore. It's 2001, and I'm stationed out in Rangel St. Elias National Park in Alaska, with 13.2 million acres of wilderness. It's one of the biggest and most remote places in the US, and that's precisely why I love it. No annoying tourists asking where the bathrooms are, no traffic jams, just you and nature. Well, most of the time. My name is Elias Kane. I wasn't one of those guys who grew up in the wild, learning to pitch tents and hunt with their bare hands. Nah, I'm a city boy through and through. Grew up in Philadelphia, stuck in that concrete jungle. But after my third office job, something snapped. It wasn't some grand epiphany. I just got tired of looking at cubicle walls and dealing with office politics. Decided I wanted to live somewhere I couldn't hear a car horn for at least a week at a time. The thing about working as a park ranger in a place like this is that it can get real lonely, real quick. Some guys don't last a year, and I get it. It's not for everyone. You've got to enjoy your own company out here, find peace in the quiet. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the isolation. It's like the park, and I have an understanding. But I'm also not stupid. Nature isn't something you take for granted. That's something I learned pretty fast. So, when they called me in that morning about a missing group of hikers, I wasn't thrilled. Not that I don't take those calls seriously, but 99% of the time, it's people who got lost off trail, sprained an ankle, or forgot their map. A couple hours later, they're found and all's well. This time, though, something was off from the get-go. The group was reported missing by a guy named Edward Redding, who had stayed behind at the base of the trail because of a bum knee. He hadn't heard from his friends, 2 guys and a woman, for nearly 24 hours, and there was no cell signal where they were last known to be. He said they were experienced hikers, which is always a bad sign when something goes wrong. It means they didn't just get lost by accident. The trail they took wasn't too far from the Nebesna River, about 12 miles into the wilderness, and it led into one of the more remote regions of the park, where even we don't patrol too often. That's where it got strange. Redding said the 3 had planned to veer off the main trail after a few miles and head toward a place called Eagle's Cradle. It's not on any official maps, but locals know about it. An old rocky gorge with cliffs that seem to shoot up from the ground out of nowhere. It's remote, dangerous, and not exactly welcoming. I met up with Redding that afternoon, and right away I could see the guy was panicking but trying to keep it together. He was in his mid-40s, graying hair, a bit overweight, definitely not the hiking type, which explained why he stayed behind. He kept apologizing for calling us out there, as if it was all his fault for letting his friends wander off. He gave me the rundown, and we set out. I had another ranger, Holly, with me. She's tougher than most guys I know, but even she wasn't thrilled about the assignment. By the time we hit the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky. We had about 5 hours of daylight left, which wasn't ideal for a search this far out, but we didn't have much of a choice. The first few miles were easy, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the quiet of the forest and the sound of our boots crunching over the dirt. But once we started getting closer to the area where the group had planned to go off trail, things got weird. The ground was soft, like it had rained, but there hadn't been any rainfall for over a week. And then there were these huge tracks, far too big for a bear and not the shape of anything I'd seen before. They were deep. Whatever made them was heavy. Holly noticed them first, and we both stopped. "Moose?" she asked, though she didn't sound convinced. I knelt down, running my fingers through the damp earth around the track. No moose I'd ever seen left prints like that. Too round, too wide. We kept moving, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. You learn to trust those instincts out here. We followed the tracks for a while, veering off the main trail, deeper into the wilderness. That's when we found the campsite. It was abandoned. 2 tents were still standing, but one was ripped open from the side, not unzipped. Redding looked like he was about to lose it, his face pale and his hands shaking. "They wouldn't just leave," he muttered. "Stay back," I told him, moving closer with Holly. We did a quick sweep of the area, calling out for the missing hikers. No answer, just the wind rustling through the trees. But there was blood. It wasn't much, just a few drops on the rocks near the torn tent, but enough to tell me something bad had gone down. Holly radioed it in, but we were too far out for anyone to reach us anytime soon. We had no choice but to keep looking. The tracks, those same massive heavy prints, led away from the campsite, heading toward the gorge. By now, Redding was insisting we turn back, but this was way over our heads. But there was no way I was leaving without at least trying to find those people. We kept moving, the tension between us so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The forest grew denser, darker, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. I tried to keep my head clear, but every step closer to the gorge made my pulse quicken. I didn't like it, not one bit. It wasn't long before we started hearing the sounds. At first it was distant, like rocks tumbling down a slope. But then, as we got closer, it changed. Low, rhythmic thudding, like something big was moving in the distance. Holly stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide. "You hear that?" I nodded, gripping the rifle slung over my shoulder. I don't use guns much. Never needed to out here. But I was damn glad I had one now. Whatever made those prints, whatever tore open that tent, was still out there. Then we saw it. Movement through the trees. Something massive, shifting in the underbrush. I raised the rifle, scanning the area, but I couldn't get a clear view. It was fast, faster than anything that size should have been. A flash of dark fur or feathers, I couldn't tell. And then it was gone. We kept moving, adrenaline pumping now. The gorge wasn't far, and I had a sick feeling that's where we'd find the hikers, or at least what was left of them. The tracks led us to the edge of the gorge, where the cliffs dropped off sharply into the rocky depths below. That's where we found the first body. It was one of the men, what was left of him anyway. His body was mangled, shredded like he'd been through a meat grinder. Holly cursed under her breath, and Redding fell to his knees, retching. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. This wasn't the work of a bear, or any animal I knew of. This was something else, something stronger, faster, more violent. We kept looking, but it didn't take long to find the other two. The second man was in pieces, scattered along the rocks near the gorge's edge. The woman, we found her further down, her body slumped against a tree, her face frozen in terror. And then, that sound again, the thudding. Louder this time, closer. I turned, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. There it was again, moving through the brush, circling us but staying just out of sight. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't leave Holly or Redding. Then, out of nowhere, it lunged. Not at me, not at Holly, but straight for Redding. The thing was massive, some twisted amalgamation of fur, muscle, and claws like nothing I'd ever seen. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with a sickening thud. Holly screamed, raising her gun, but it was too late. The creature tore into Redding, ripping him apart like he was nothing. I fired, once, twice, but the bullets barely seemed to slow it down. It turned, blood dripping from its jaws, and fixed its gaze on me. That's when I saw it up close. It wasn't just big, it was grotesque. It had the body of a bear, but its limbs were longer, more human-like, with claws that could slice through bone like butter. Its face was a twisted snarl, somewhere between wolf and man, but with an intelligence in its movements that sent a chill down my spine. I fired again, emptying the rifle into its chest. This time it staggered back, letting out a guttural, almost pain sound, but it didn't stop. It charged again, and I braced myself for the end. That's when Holly, quick, thinking as ever, hurled a flare right into its face. The creature roared, not in pain, but in fury, and for a moment it was blinded. I grabbed Holly's arm and we ran. We didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until we collapsed from exhaustion. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, it was dark, and we were both covered in blood and dirt. There was no sign of the creature, no sign that it had followed us. But I know it's still out there, somewhere in the gorge, waiting. They brought in a team to retrieve the bodies and investigate, but they won't find anything. Not really. Not anything that makes sense, anyway. The official report says it was a bear attack, but Holly and I know better. As for Redding, well, they'll say he died trying to find his friends. A hero in his own right. But I'll always remember him as the guy who asked, right before we left the trailhead, "You think we'll see any bears?" Hell of a punchline, don't you think? I remember the first time I walked into the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. It was 2001, a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I had just gone through a nasty divorce and, well, let's just say I wasn't winning any Father of the Year awards. My name's Doug Tanner, but people around here just call me Tanner. After the split, I figured I'd trade in my city life for some fresh air and a simpler existence. I wasn't looking for peace, though. More like distraction. I thought the mountains would give me that, and for a while they did. You get to know a place like that over time, the way it breathes, how the wind moves differently depending on where you stand. The Appalachian Trail has this strange rhythm. At first it seems peaceful, calm even, but then you notice things. Branches broken in odd ways, sounds that don't match the animals you expect. The locals in town would say things like, "That mountain's got a temper." I figured they were just selling that backwoods mystique to tourists. I'd been guiding small groups on hikes for about a year by then. Business was steady, nothing too wild. Mostly families or retirees looking for some nature without breaking a sweat. On the day everything went sideways, I had a solo client, a photographer named Peter Covey. He was one of those intense types, all serious eyes and hardly any small talk. He'd come from Asheville looking for shots of old-growth forests, and we'd been planning to hit a part of the trail that was a bit more secluded. Peter liked quiet. I could respect that. We started early. Peter had his camera slung around his neck like it was another limb, and every so often he'd stop and frame a shot. He never said a word about it. I would just stand there waiting until he was done before moving on. I remember cracking a joke about him being able to sell those pictures as authentic rugged wilderness, and how people would pay good money for it. He gave me a sideways glance, didn't even crack a smile. Tough crowd. After a couple of hours, we veered off the main path. This wasn't unusual. I'd taken other folks through side routes before. Sometimes they wanted the thrill of being off the beaten path, you know, like they were discovering something new. But this time, it felt different. The trees were thicker here, closer together. The sounds changed too. You stop hearing birds after a while, and it's like the forest holds its breath. I made some half-assed observation about how you could always tell when a storm was coming, but Peter didn't care. We hit this clearing and Peter suddenly got animated. Well, as animated as he ever got. There was this massive oak tree with these deep, jagged cuts in its trunk. He was snapping away at it when I noticed something strange. The cuts weren't random, they were too precise, like someone had taken a hatchet to the tree with purpose. I knelt down and ran my hand over the grooves. Old. Real old. "You think this was done by someone?" I asked Peter. But he was too focused on his lens to answer. A shiver ran down my spine. Not fear, exactly. Just a sense that something wasn't quite right. We decided to keep moving, heading deeper into the thick of it. That's when the smell hit. Rotten, but not like a dead animal. This was sharper, more metallic, like rusted iron mixed with something foul. Peter wrinkled his nose and said, "You smell that?" "Yeah," I replied, though I didn't really want to talk about it. We pushed forward. The ground was softer here, our boots sinking into the earth with every step. Then Peter stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide as he stared at something up ahead. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A body, slumped against a tree, its limbs all wrong, twisted in ways no living thing could manage. The face was unrecognizable, but the clothes were still mostly intact, dirty and torn, but human. I've seen death before. Hell, I've been around enough hunting accidents and wild animals to know what happens when a body gets left out too long. But this wasn't an animal attack. There was no tearing, no claw marks. The body looked crushed, like something had pressed down on it with enough force to break bones without breaking skin. And the smell, the iron, it was stronger here, nearly choking. Peter, the tough, silent type, was shaking now. He fumbled with his camera, snapping pictures like he was on autopilot. I didn't say anything. What could I say? We were way off the trail, no cell service, and about an hour's hike from the nearest ranger station. "We should get out of here," Peter finally muttered, breaking his silence. But as we turned to leave, that's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl, not like any animal I'd ever heard. My first thought was a black bear, but it didn't fit. This was different, more deliberate. Peter froze, his eyes wide as saucers. I reached for the small knife I always carried, completely useless, I knew, but it was better than nothing. The trees started to shake, not from the wind, but from something big moving through them. I grabbed Peter's arm and whispered, "Move now!" We didn't run. Running would have been stupid. But we moved fast as we could without breaking into a full sprint. I could hear whatever it was, still behind us, not far but not gaining either. It was like it was toying with us, letting us think we had a chance. Peter stopped suddenly, turned, and aimed his camera toward the sound. "What the hell are you doing?" I hissed at him, but he just started clicking away, snapping photo after photo into the trees. Then I saw it. A flash of movement between the trunks, something massive, something not quite animal but not human either. It had fur, but it moved on two legs, fast, almost like a wolf, but bigger, bulkier. Peter lowered his camera, eyes locked on the thing, and whispered, "It's watching us." I grabbed him by the arm again, pulling him away. We started moving faster now, not caring about noise anymore. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees getting thicker, the ground muddier. I heard Peter behind me muttering to himself, I got it. I didn't know what he meant until I saw it in his hands, his camera, aimed straight at me. He wasn't photographing me, though. He was photographing what was behind me. I didn't stop to look. I couldn't. The growling got closer. I could feel it more than hear it, like it was vibrating the air around me. I turned just in time to see Peter disappear into the underbrush, yanked backward by something huge, his scream cut short. I froze. I couldn't see what had him, only the thrashing of bushes and trees as it dragged him off. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing against a rock, chest heaving, my mind racing. Peter's screams echoed in my head, and I knew there was no way I could go back for him, even if I had wanted to. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, disoriented and covered in mud, I found the ranger station closed. I had no choice but to hike back to the trailhead alone, every sound in the woods making my heart race. Later, when I finally got in touch with the authorities, they searched the woods for Peter. They didn't find him, not at first. They found his camera, though. The pictures were the only thing left of him, grainy, out-of-focus shots of trees, the forest floor, and one last photo, blurry but unmistakable. A massive figure, something not quite animal, standing on two legs watching us. They called it a bear attack. Of course they did, but I knew better. My name is Russ Feldman, and this all happened to me back in 1998 when I was RV camping near the rugged mountains of Kootenay National Park in British Columbia. I'd saved up for a camper, thinking it'd be a quiet way to spend time in nature, maybe fish a little, drink some cold ones by the fire, and forget about the day-to-day grind. I wasn't looking for any thrills. In fact, I wanted the opposite, a break from the stress I thought I'd left behind back in Seattle. But I quickly learned that isolation has a way of attracting things you'd never expect. The drive was long, with the kind of winding roads that snake between trees tall enough to block out the sky. Kootenay is remote, even for a national park. It's not a weekend road trip for most people. I parked my RV on the edge of a valley that dropped steeply toward a clear blue river below, the type you see on postcards. The whole area was deserted, with nothing but the sounds of water and birds, absolute silence, the kind that makes you think you're finally alone. It was perfect. Until that night. It started small. A flash of movement, a strange noise outside. Around 11 p.m., I heard what sounded like shuffling around my RV. It was faint, barely loud enough to reach me over the occasional gusts of wind. At first I thought it was a stray animal, maybe a bear or a mountain goat curious about the smell of the sausages I'd cooked up earlier. But it didn't move off like an animal would. It just lingered, shifting here and there like it was trying to figure something out. I've camped enough times to know animals lose interest once they realize you don't have food out. So after another few minutes, I grabbed my flashlight. I told myself it was nothing. But as I flicked on the light and peered through the window, I caught sight of something, just the faintest outline of a figure, ducking down and slipping behind the trees. It was fast, like a flicker, but unmistakably human. My first thought? Maybe some hiker had lost their way, but the nearest trailhead was a good 1.5 miles out. Besides, who'd be hiking this late? I kept the flashlight on, shining it out at random to make it clear I was awake and aware. I laughed it off, cracked open a beer, and told myself I was overthinking it. People don't just lurk around your campsite, right? I mean, this was Canada, the friendliest place on earth. But the unease wouldn't leave, and after an hour of listening to the sounds outside, I climbed into the RV and locked the door, feeling a little silly but safer for it. Around 2 a.m., I heard something tapping on the window, light taps like someone was testing it, figuring out if they could get inside. I froze. It was clear, deliberate, like the person knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't move, just held my breath and stayed as quiet as I could. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped, and I finally exhaled, thinking maybe it was over. But as I leaned closer, I heard it again, a scratch this time, like a knife or a sharp tool dragging along the metal siding of my RV. I was armed with a little pocket knife, and I felt ridiculous holding it as I crouched by the window, peeking out. Nothing was visible, just darkness and shadows. I considered calling for help, but there was no signal. There wasn't even a ranger station close by. Just me, alone, in a tin box in the middle of the forest with God knows who out there. The scratching moved to the door. I could see the handle moving ever so slightly, like whoever was out there was testing it, seeing how much it would take to push open. I gripped my knife tighter, waiting, thinking if they came in I'd at least have a shot at surprising them. Then, silence. The scratching, the shifting, all of it just stopped. A part of me thought maybe they'd moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were just waiting for something, watching to see what I'd do. Minutes dragged into hours, and as dawn broke I could finally make out more than just shapes and shadows. There, on the side of the RV, were marks, scratches that cut through the paint and metal. They were too deliberate to be from an animal, long deep lines, as if someone had taken a knife and traced it slowly, with purpose. I had no choice. I couldn't stay. I decided I'd head out, find a gas station or a ranger, someone who could help. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. It wouldn't start. I tried again, panic rising in my throat, but it was useless. Someone had cut the fuel line. I was stranded. Now I knew they weren't here by accident. They'd planned this. I grabbed whatever I could. A hammer, my flashlight, the little pocket knife, and headed toward the river. There was a trail I'd noticed the day before that led to a ranger station about 6 miles out. If I kept moving, I could make it by midday. The forest was thick, and every step felt like I was walking through molasses. The silence pressed in on me, each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sending my pulse racing. I heard it again, that shuffle, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I couldn't see anything, but I knew they were there, tracking me, waiting to strike. As I picked up the pace, I spotted something in the distance. A figure, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing, standing on the trail, just waiting. He was holding a machete, letting it swing back and forth, the blade catching bits of sunlight through the trees. I ducked behind a tree, clutching my hammer, trying to stay as quiet as I could. He moved forward slowly, scanning the area, muttering to himself in a low voice. I could make out the words. Something about needing another one for the collection. I crept back, staying low, trying to circle around him and get off the trail. My plan was to get to higher ground and make my way back to the road somehow, even if it took all day. But as I moved, I must have stepped on something because his head snapped up, and he turned in my direction. I bolted. The chase was fast, but I didn't look back. I could hear him crashing through the brush behind me, grunting as he got closer. My lungs burned, but I forced myself forward, my legs pumping as I raced through the underbrush. I stumbled, hit the ground hard, and felt the hammer slip from my hand. I scrambled for it, but by the time I looked up, he was standing right over me. He smirked, his face twisted and cruel, looking like he'd just caught the biggest fish of his life. Without saying a word, he lifted the machete. My hand closed around a rock, and I threw it as hard as I could, hitting him square in the jaw. He stumbled, giving me the second I needed to scramble up and run again. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. But then I saw it, a clearing up ahead with a small cabin I hadn't noticed before. It was old, dilapidated, the kind of place you'd expect to find abandoned decades ago. I didn't have much choice, so I dashed inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was dark, with barely any light filtering in through the cracks. My eyes adjusted, and I looked around, hoping to find something, anything that could help me. Then I noticed the walls. They were covered with photos. Polaroids of campers, hikers, people who had probably thought they were alone out here, just like I had. And there were marks on the floor, streaks of dried blood and patterns that showed signs of a struggle. I didn't have time to process any of it. I could hear him outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he came closer. I looked around, spotted an old rifle leaning against the wall, and grabbed it. I didn't know if it was loaded, but I was out of options. He burst through the door, and I raised the rifle, pulling the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small cabin, and he staggered back, clutching his chest. His face went from smug to shocked, and he stumbled out of the cabin, collapsing onto the ground. I stumbled back to the trail, every part of me numb and in shock. The hike back to the road was a blur, but eventually, I stumbled upon a couple of hikers who had a radio. They got help, and soon enough, park rangers were combing the area. They found him, lifeless, sprawled where he'd fallen, and in his pockets, they found IDs, wallets, bits and pieces of the people he'd hunted down. When they checked the cabin, they counted at least 20 different sets of belongings, some dating back years. I'm Elijah Blackfeather, and in 2015, I had an experience deep in the Adirondack Mountains of New York that still makes me question what's lurking in the wild. Growing up among the Mohawk people, I've always felt a strong connection to the land. My friends joke that I'm more comfortable in hiking boots than I am in regular shoes, and they're not wrong. I decided to take a solo trip into the Adirondacks to clear my head after a messy breakup. Nothing heals a bruised heart like fresh air and the smell of pine, right? I packed my gear, double-checked my supplies, and headed out early one Saturday morning. The forecast promised clear skies, and I was eager to leave the noise of civilization behind. The trail was less traveled, which suited me just fine. I enjoyed the solitude, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional chatter of squirrels that seemed to question my intrusion into their domain. Around midday, I stopped by a crystal-clear stream to refill my canteen and have a quick lunch. The water was icy cold, refreshing, and tasted cleaner than anything bottled. As I sat there munching on a granola bar, I noticed something odd. A silence that blanketed the area. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the forest was waiting for something. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was projecting my own feelings onto the environment. Pressing on, I came across an old campsite. It looked abandoned, but not in the usual way. The tent was shredded, and camping gear was strewn about haphazardly. Pots and pans lay scattered, some with dents as if they'd been struck by something heavy. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the sudden drop in temperature. The afternoon sun was still shining, but the air felt unnaturally cold. Well, that's not exactly inviting, I muttered to myself. I considered turning back, but dismissed the idea. I'd come this far, and my pride wouldn't let me retreat just because of an old, wrecked campsite. Besides, I was curious. Maybe too curious for my own good. I approached the campsite cautiously, scanning the ground for any signs of recent activity. There were footprints, but they were erratic, as if whoever made them was running in panic. Among the scattered items, I found a journal half buried under leaves. It was damp but still legible. Flipping through the pages, I realized it belonged to someone named Thomas. His last entry mentioned strange noises at night and shadows that didn't seem to belong. Great, just what I need. A haunted forest, I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But unease was settling in, and I couldn't shake it off. Deciding it was best to move on, I pocketed the journal, intending to hand it over to the park authorities later. As I continued along the trail, the trees grew denser, and the canopy above thickened, allowing only specks of sunlight to pierce through. The air smelled different here, earthier, with a hint of something metallic. An hour passed, and I began to hear noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, not uncommon in the woods, but these sounds seemed deliberate, like footsteps matching my own. I stopped abruptly, and so did the noises. I started walking again, and the sounds resumed. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but I wasn't keen on being the mouse. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No reply, just silence. I decided to pick up the pace. If someone was trying to mess with me, they'd have to work harder. But the faster I walked, the louder the footsteps became, closing in but never revealing themselves. Out of nowhere, a deer burst through the bushes, darting across the path and disappearing into the thicket. It was missing patches of fur, and its eyes looked wild, terrified. Not exactly the poster deer for woodland serenity. "Okay, Elijah, maybe it's time to head back," I conceded. Pride be damned, there was no shame in trusting your instincts. As I turned around, I caught sight of something in my peripheral vision, a silhouette standing between the trees. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Before I could get a better look, it vanished behind the trunks. I wasn't sticking around for an encore. I began to jog, keeping my eyes on the path but my ears tuned to any movement behind me. The forest seemed to close in, each tree morphing into a potential hiding spot for whatever was out there. Then I heard it. A guttural sound that didn't resemble any animal I'd encountered. It was like the grinding of rocks mixed with a low hiss. My heart pounded in my chest as adrenaline kicked in. I broke into a full sprint, weaving through the trees, ignoring the branches that whipped against my face and arms. My backpack felt like it weighed a ton, but I didn't dare stop to adjust it. Suddenly I tripped over something and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. Pushing myself up, I realized I'd stumbled over a discarded hiking boot. Next to it was a torn backpack, and not far away, what looked like a human arm partially buried under leaves. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay focused. This was no time to lose it. I needed to get out of there and alert the authorities. As I stood up, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. A trap? No, thankfully just a sprain from the fall. I could still move, but not as fast. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift cane, I hobbled forward. The sounds behind me grew louder, branches snapping, heavy footsteps closing in. I glanced back and saw it clearly this time. The creature stood upright like a man, but was covered in matted fur. Its face resembled that of a wolf, but the snout was shorter, and its teeth were jagged, protruding at odd angles. Its eyes were deep-set, reflecting no light. "Not today," I whispered, pushing myself to move faster despite the pain. The path ahead forked, and I took the route that led downhill, hoping gravity would aid my escape. The creature let out a roar, a sound so primal it vibrated in my bones. It was chasing me, and it was fast. I spotted a narrow crevice between two large boulders, too small for the creature, but just big enough for me. Summoning every ounce of strength, I squeezed into the gap. The rocks scraped against my back and chest, but I managed to wedge myself in. The creature reached the boulders and clawed at the opening, its massive arms unable to reach me. Its claws left deep gouges in the stone, and its frustration was palpable. "Ever heard of personal space?" I quipped, my attempt at humor falling flat even to my own ears. It snarled and paced outside, occasionally ramming its body against the rocks in an attempt to dislodge them. I knew this hiding spot was temporary. Sooner or later it would find a way in or wait me out. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal. 1 bar, better than nothing. I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Figures. Then I remembered the flare gun in my backpack, a precaution I'd almost forgotten about. Carefully, I unzipped the bag and pulled it out. I had one shot. "Let's hope you're not fireproof," I muttered. Taking a deep breath, I aimed the flare gun at the creature's face and pulled the trigger. The flare shot out, hitting it square in the chest. Flames erupted and the creature recoiled, emitting a horrifying screech. Seizing the moment, I scrambled out of the crevice and darted downhill. The creature was distracted but not defeated. Behind me, I could hear it patting out the flames and resuming the chase. The forest thinned as I neared a clearing. Up ahead, I saw a rustic cabin, a ranger station perhaps. Smoke wafted from the chimney, signaling someone's presence. I burst into the clearing, waving my arms. "Help, please!" An older man stepped out onto the porch, startled by my sudden appearance. "What's going on?" he shouted. "No time to explain, something's after me." He didn't hesitate. "Inside, quickly!" We bolted into the cabin, and he slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locking it securely. The interior was modest but sturdy, with reinforced windows and a sizable rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Name's Walter," he said, grabbing the rifle. "Care to tell me what's chasing you?" I caught my breath. "I don't know what it is. A creature, something I've never seen before. It's already killed at least one person." As if on cue, a loud thud shook the door. The creature was outside, its shadow visible through the small window. Walter peered through the glass. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought those were just old legends." "You know what that thing is?" He nodded grimly. "Some call it the Wendigo. Stories say it's a spirit that possesses humans, turning them into cannibalistic beasts. But I always figured it was just tales to scare kids. Well, it's very real and very angry." The creature rammed the door again, cracking the wood. "Help me push the dresser against the door," Walter ordered. We heaved the heavy piece of furniture over, adding a barrier. The creature continued its assault, the door and dresser groaning under the strain. Walter handed me a hunting knife, in case it gets in. "Great, because I was just thinking I needed a toothpick," I replied, attempting to mask my fear. He gave a slight chuckle. "Got spirit, kid. I like that." The creature began attacking the windows, its claws scraping against the glass. Walter took aim with the rifle and fired. The shot shattered the window, and the creature let out another ear-splitting roar but didn't retreat. "Bullets aren't doing much," Walter muttered. "Maybe we can trap it somehow." He considered this. "There's a cellar beneath us. If we can lure it in and lock it down there, we might buy ourselves some time." "Time for what?" "For the sun to come up. These things are less active during daylight. That's vampires." He smirked. "Details." We formulated a quick plan. Opening the cellar door, we made enough noise to draw the creature's attention. Then, standing at opposite ends of the room, we waited. The creature crashed through the weakened door, eyes locking onto us. It seemed even more monstrous up close, saliva dripping from its fangs. "Hey, ugly, bet you can't catch me," I yelled, bolting toward the cellar entrance. It took the bait, lunging after me. At the last second, I dodged to the side, and the creature stumbled forward into the dark abyss. Walter slammed the cellar door shut and secured it with a heavy iron bar. The creature thrashed below, the entire cabin shaking from its fury. "That won't hold it for long," Walter warned. "Then what?" He grabbed a canister of gasoline from a corner. "We burn it." "You're full of surprises, Walter. Learned a thing or two in my years out here." We doused the cellar entrance with gasoline. As the creature began to break through the door, Walter lit a match and tossed it onto the fuel. Flames erupted, engulfing the cellar doorway. The creature let out a final haunting scream as the fire consumed it. The thrashing subsided and an eerie silence filled the cabin. "Is it over?" I asked cautiously. "For now," Walter replied, eyes fixed on the smoldering remains. "But there's always more mysteries in these woods." I slumped onto a chair, exhaustion washing over me. "Next time I need a break, I'm booking a beach vacation." Walter laughed. "Probably a good idea." We waited until dawn, ensuring the creature was truly gone. As sunlight filtered through the trees, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "Thank you, Walter," I don't think I would have made it without you, he shrugged. We look out for each other out here. Speaking of which, we should report this. Who's going to believe us? He gave me a knowing look. They'll believe the evidence. Together, we ventured outside. Amid the charred remains, we found bones. Not just of the creature, but of its victims. It was a grim discovery, but necessary for closure. Authorities arrived later that day, alerted by Walter's radio. They conducted their investigation, and the area was cordoned off. The official report listed it as a tragic encounter with a wild animal, details unspecified. A few days later, I did some research, digging into local legends and historical accounts. Stories of the Wendigo appeared in Algonquin folklore, a malevolent spirit associated with insatiable greed and hunger. While skeptics dismissed it as myth, I knew there was more to it. Perhaps the creature had once been human, succumbing to darker instincts. Or maybe it was something beyond our understanding, a reminder that nature still holds secrets we can't fathom. Either way, I learned that some legends have teeth, and it's best to keep a respectful distance. My name is Travis Elroy, and in 1993, in a remote stretch of South Dakota near the Badlands, I found out aliens are a lot less E.T. and a lot more Chainsaw Massacre. I just finished 2 weeks of unpaid leave fixing up my brother's busted car, a 1967 Impala that I suspect was held together by duct tape and my brother's prayers. This wasn't even my home, just a pit stop. The place had no cell phone service, and the locals thought a Wi-Fi hotspot was a setting on the microwave. That day, I decided to unwind by taking a drive into the endless fields of nothing. A single-lane highway snaked through the desolation, and I rolled down the window to let in the prairie air. At least here, the silence wasn't filled with the sound of my brother whining about engine parts. It was just me, the car, and a cassette of Tom Petty blasting through the worn speakers. Or so I thought. About 30 miles into nowhere, the car coughed twice and died. I stared at the steering wheel and cursed under my breath. Typical. I popped the hood and stared blankly at the engine like I had any idea what to do. A mechanic? I was not. That's when I noticed something. Silence. No wind, no crickets, not even a bird. I turned back toward the road and spotted a shimmer on the horizon. At first I thought it was a heat mirage, but it moved too deliberately, like it had intent. Before I could process it, the shimmer solidified into a craft hovering no more than 20 feet off the ground. It wasn't the saucer I expected. The thing looked more like a jagged black diamond, its surface pulsating like it was alive. A hum filled the air, growing louder until it pressed on my skull. Then came the beam, a bright, unnatural light that lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing. My stomach flipped, and I could swear I saw my boots dangling in midair before everything went dark. When I came to, I was strapped to a table in a room that reeked of metal and decay. The walls were covered in pulsating organic ridges, part spacecraft, part living creature. Across from me stood two figures. They weren't the little green men from cheap sci-fi flicks. These were taller than humans, with elongated limbs and bodies wrapped in some kind of translucent, gelatinous membrane that glistened under the harsh lights. Their heads were smooth, featureless domes, save for slits that occasionally opened to reveal flickering movement beneath. "Welcome," one said in a flat, synthesized voice, clearly the result of some kind of translation device. "You are the 15th specimen retrieved for Phase 7. Phase 7? What the hell is that?" My voice cracked as I yanked at the restraints, which felt less like metal and more like tendons wrapped around my wrists. The alien tilted its head as if the question amused it. "Assimilation. We require behavioral data. Your kind demonstrates resistance. We must understand." Understand what? My brain scrambled for logic. How to piss people off? The second alien stepped closer, holding a tool that resembled a scalpel made of liquid light. It began to trace it along my arm, and the surface of my skin sizzled without cutting. "Survival instinct," it said. "Conflict, violence, traits that must be suppressed." My mouth outran my brain. So you're saying you don't get how humans work because we don't sit around holding tentacles and singing Kumbaya? You could have just read a history book. The first alien's dome flickered. We have observed your conflicts. We require first-hand data. The table tilted upright, forcing me to face a hologram that sprang to life before me. It displayed what I could only describe as a highlight reel of human atrocities. Wars, murders, and riots. Mixed in were random scenes of modern life, from traffic jams to bar fights. Then the images shifted to their plans for assimilation. Grotesque hybrids of human and alien, their bodies mutilated to accommodate their overlords' designs. My stomach churned. Okay, I get it, I said, trying to stall. You want to make us docile, right? You're afraid of us fighting back. Let me save you some time. That's not going to work. The second alien paused, its slits widening as it turned to its companion. Resilient, it said. This one will suffice for dissection. Wait, I shouted. Don't I at least get a last request? Or are you the kind of species that doesn't have a sense of humor? The alien tilted its head again. Humor? Yeah, like jokes. I threw out the first thing that came to mind. Why don't aliens eat clowns? Because they taste funny. The second alien stopped moving, and for a split second I thought I'd broken it. Then it turned to its partner. Illogical. Exactly, I blurted. Humans are illogical. You're trying to map out instincts and emotions like they're equations. But guess what? We don't work that way. The aliens exchanged a series of clicks that the translator didn't bother to interpret. Then the restraints tightened, and the table began to descend toward a whirring device below. Panic surged through me. Thinking fast, I twisted my hand, forcing my wrist to pop in a direction it really wasn't supposed to go. Pain shot up my arm, but the tendon-like restraint loosened just enough. I yanked free and grabbed the nearest object, a shard of some alien material. It was sharp enough to slice through the other restraint, and I rolled off the table just as the whirring blade hissed past my head. The aliens moved faster than I expected, their limbs elongating as they lunged toward me. I slashed wildly with the shard, managing to sever part of the translucent membrane on one of them. It let out a sound somewhere between a screech and static feedback before recoiling. Your resistance is futile, the first alien said, advancing. Yeah, well, so's your customer service, I shot back, dodging its grasp and bolting for the only exit I could see, a pulsating doorway at the far end of the chamber. The ship's interior was a labyrinth of glowing corridors, but I didn't have time to think. Alarms blared and the hum of pursuing footsteps echoed behind me. I darted into a side chamber and stumbled upon what I can only describe as a grotesque trophy room. Human remains, mutilated and displayed in various states of dissection, lined the walls. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to move. That's when I saw her, a woman still alive, strapped to a similar table. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine as she screamed through some kind of gag. Without thinking, I slashed her restraints and she collapsed into my arms. Who? What? She stammered. Travis, I said quickly. Long story. Let's focus on not dying. We sprinted down the corridor together, dodging beams of light that shot from unseen sources. One grazed my shoulder and the burn left a sickening smell. Where the hell are we going? She shouted. Preferably Earth, I snapped back. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in what looked like a control room. Panels of shifting lights covered the walls, and a massive window overlooked the planet below. I didn't have a clue how to operate alien technology, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. Can you fly this thing? She asked. Lady, I can barely fly a kite. I grabbed what looked like a lever and yanked. The ship shuddered violently, and the hum of the engine changed pitch. The aliens burst into the room, their elongated limbs scraping against the walls as they advanced. One of them aimed a weapon, a sleek, tubular device that didn't look like it was meant for hugs. I grabbed the woman and dove behind the console as a beam of light exploded above us. Desperation kicked in. I slammed my fist against every button and lever I could find. The ship lurched again, and the window filled with the fiery glow of Earth's atmosphere. What did you do? She screamed. Best guess? I set this thing to crash, I said, pulling her toward an escape pod I'd spotted in the corner. We barely squeezed inside before the door sealed shut. Through the pod's tiny window, I watched as the ship erupted into flames, pieces of it disintegrating in the upper atmosphere. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then the pod shuddered violently, and I realized it was hurtling toward the ground at an alarming speed. We landed in a farmer's field, the impact rattling my teeth. Smoke and sparks filled the air as I kicked the hatch open. We stumbled out, bruised but alive. The woman turned to me, shaking her head. "You're insane, you know that?" "Yeah," I said, looking up at the sky. "But it worked." Later, when the authorities came, I told them everything. The field was littered with wreckage, proof enough for them to believe I wasn't just another lunatic with a UFO story. But the remains of the aliens were the real kicker. Half melted, their translucent forms were scattered among the debris, a grotesque testament to their experiments. Turns out they were part of an expedition from a dying planet called Vrixar. Their goal? Harvest humanity's instincts to engineer their survival. Guess they underestimated just how stubborn we can be. As for me, I walked away with a busted shoulder, a newfound appreciation for duct tape, and the nagging feeling that I'd be keeping my windows shut for a while. I'm Bryce Anders, and I've been a forest ranger for about 8 years, give or take. This all happened in 2003, which feels like a lifetime ago. I don't tell this story often because, honestly, it sounds like something you'd read about in one of those tabloids at a gas station checkout. Except I lived it, and the people involved didn't walk away. I was stationed out in Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, Arizona. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me outside, which was the whole point. You get some crazy stuff out there. Drug runners, lost hikers, the occasional rattlesnake bite. Nothing really gets under your skin after a while. You develop this thick hide when dealing with the desert's unpredictability. Now, this place is huge, sprawling over miles of scorching heat and cacti with little water to speak of. You could drive for an hour and still be in the middle of nowhere, with not a soul in sight. That's the setting. So picture that for a second. Just me, cacti as far as the eye can see, and an endless sky that never rains. It was the middle of the week, dead quiet like it usually is. The sun had started sinking when the call came through. Some campers had radioed in from the Alamo Canyon trailhead about a missing person. 2 families out hiking, an uncle, 2 nephews, and one of their buddies had gone ahead of the rest. The plan was to meet up at the camp later, but they never showed. No big deal, I thought. Probably took a wrong turn or decided to camp out overnight somewhere off trail. I didn't rush. Around 7 in the evening, I hitched up the old ATV and started heading out toward the trailhead. The sun was setting, casting these long, harsh shadows across the desert floor. But here's the kicker. About halfway there, I got a call from dispatch, saying that the campers had found something. They didn't say what, but their voice had that tone that screams, "Not good." I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was probably just a wild animal, or one of the kids got spooked by a coyote. Stuff like that happens all the time, but by the time I got out there, everything just felt wrong. You know how people say they get that feeling of dread? I had that, but I pushed through. When I arrived, the 2 families were huddled near their tents. Their faces were white as sheets, and one of the guys, can't remember his name, was holding his stomach like he was gonna puke. The kid who radioed in, Mike or something, pointed me toward the direction of Alamo Canyon. He didn't have to tell me twice. I grabbed my flashlight, gun in its holster, and set off. The trail was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick scrub and saguaros that looked more like towering ghosts than plants. The desert has a way of playing tricks on you when the light starts fading, but I kept my focus on the path. About 20 minutes in, I spotted it. At first, it looked like a discarded sleeping bag, but as I got closer, the smell hit me, a rotting stench that filled the air so thick you could taste it. It was the uncle. Or at least what was left of him. The top half of his body was there, but the legs, they were just gone. Like something had ripped him apart, clean through the middle. And the worst part? His torso was covered in what looked like bite marks, ragged chunks of flesh torn out, but no blood around him. Whatever did this didn't drag him. He died right there, and I don't think it was quick. I had to step back and take a breath. The last thing you want to do is lose your head when you're in the middle of nowhere. I called in the situation and kept moving. There were still 3 people unaccounted for. Maybe they got away, or maybe... well, I didn't want to think about the ore. As I pushed farther into the canyon, things got weirder. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt. I knew I wasn't alone. I found the next one, the buddy, about a quarter mile from the uncle. Same deal. His chest was shredded, like something had clawed its way inside. His face was locked in this expression of absolute terror, eyes wide, jaws slack. Whatever got him, he saw it coming. And like the uncle, there was no sign of a struggle. No trail of blood, no scuffle, just his body, torn open. Now I've seen mountain lion attacks before. Hell, I've even seen coyotes tear apart a deer carcass, but this was something different. The bites were too large, too savage, but not in a way that made sense. They weren't feeding. This was something else. Something deliberate. At this point, I was starting to question my sanity. I mean, what could do this? Not an animal, not anything I knew of. But that didn't matter. I still had 2 kids out there, and I wasn't about to let them end up like the others. I kept moving, even though every instinct was telling me to turn back. The canyon walls loomed higher the deeper I went, and the sky was starting to darken to an inky black. It was at this point I found tracks. Not human, though. Something bigger. They reminded me of a bear's paw print, but more elongated. And there were too many claws. Way too many. Then I heard it. Not a growl, not a roar. Just this low, heavy breathing, like it was watching me. I froze, hand on my gun, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. But the breathing didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from all around me, like the canyon itself was alive and closing in. I found the first nephew near a small rock outcrop. His body had been mangled, limbs twisted at impossible angles, his skull crushed in. I couldn't look for more than a second before I had to move. I had to keep going no matter what, because if I didn't, that last kid, he wasn't going to make it. I called out, my voice barely carrying in the oppressive silence. And then finally a response. Faint, but there. A whimper, somewhere up ahead. I pushed through the scrub, heart pounding in my ears. The last nephew was curled up in a crevice, his face streaked with tears. He was shaking so bad I thought he'd pass out right there. He managed to say one thing before collapsing. It wasn't human. I didn't need him to explain. We weren't alone. I turned, gun drawn, and that's when I saw it. Standing on the ridge above us, silhouetted by the fading moonlight. It wasn't a bear, that much I know. It stood on 2 legs, its back hunched, covered in what looked like dark matted fur. But its arms were too long, its hands too human-like, and it was staring right at us. Those dark pits where its eyes should have been bore into me, unblinking. I didn't wait. I grabbed the kid and ran. I've never moved so fast in my life, and even then I could feel it chasing us. Not running, just moving, closing the distance without ever picking up speed. I didn't turn around, but I could feel it getting closer, the weight of its presence like a shadow over us. We burst out of the canyon and back to the trailhead where the families were waiting. No one asked questions, and I didn't give answers. I threw the kid into the truck and we tore out of there. The official report says that the uncle and his friend were killed by an animal attack. That's what I put down. Nobody's asking questions about what kind of animal could rip apart 2 grown men and a teenager, though. But here's the thing. I don't care what people think they know. I don't care what the report says. I know what I saw, and that thing is still out there. You won't catch me going back into Alamo Canyon anytime soon. And if you're ever in Oregon Pipe, do yourself a favor. Stick to the marked trails. It's not the heat that'll kill you. My name's Darren Kinsler, and it was 1994 back in Rangel St. Elias National Park in Alaska, where the mountains stretch into the clouds, and you could swear the place is as untouched as it gets. Now most folks say I don't have the sense to avoid trouble, but I've been out here too long to get spooked by a dark sky or snapping twig. I've got a sense of humor sharper than most folks, and I figure that's what keeps me sane out here in all this vast emptiness. I'd been called in to lead a search and rescue for 2 hikers who were reported missing 2 days ago. From what I'd gathered, they were supposed to be seasoned trekkers from Fairbanks, experienced enough not to wander too far off the trails. Funny thing though, everyone's experienced until they're not. I met up with another officer named Rusty Collier, who'd driven up from Anchorage for the case. Rusty's the kind of guy who could joke about falling off a cliff and not lose a wink of sleep. So when he gave me a half grin and slapped my shoulder, I figured we'd be just fine. The first day was more routine than thrilling. We were scouring the lower trails, calling out and listening for anything besides our own voices echoing back at us. There was nothing out of the ordinary. The quiet was as thick as the clouds, and the only thing breaking it was the occasional crackle of my radio. Around dusk, we decided to make camp near a small, rocky clearing with a view over a river below. Rusty went to gather firewood while I set up camp. I watched the sky shift to a bruised purple, thinking maybe I'd been out here long enough to start waxing poetic about sunsets. That was when the first odd thing happened. I looked up, and there, across the clearing, was something I could barely make sense of. It looked like a wolf, but not exactly. The thing was massive, far bigger than any wolf I'd ever come across in these parts, with long, wiry fur that seemed to shift colors in the dimming light, almost blending with the shadows around it. It stood perfectly still, its body hunched low as if sizing me up. "Rusty, you seeing this?" I muttered out loud, but there was no response. Rusty was off somewhere, oblivious, and I didn't want to call out too loud in case I spooked whatever it was. Then it moved, not with the usual grace of an animal in its element, but in an almost jerky, mechanical way, like it was imitating the gait of a wolf without quite nailing it. I took a step back, nearly tripping over my pack. My mind raced through everything I knew about the animals out here. Nothing fit this creature's description, not in any manual or ranger briefing I'd read. Then Rusty finally returned, oblivious and holding an armful of firewood. He dropped it when he saw my expression. "What's got you spooked, man?" I gestured toward the edge of the clearing, but by then, the thing had melted into the shadows. There was something, looked like a wolf, but bigger. Didn't move right. Rusty just laughed, though his smile faded a little when he saw my face. "You're serious?" I nodded. Dead serious. That thing was watching me. Rusty shrugged. "Could be a grizzly, maybe one that got kicked out of its territory. They can look strange when they're gaunt." But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a bear. We let the matter drop, and the night moved along with the usual banter and Rusty's terrible jokes, though I kept one hand near my knife the whole time. The next morning, we hiked up toward higher ground, hoping to get a better vantage point. It was a tough climb, but Rusty and I weren't exactly new to this terrain. Halfway up, though, we hit an old cabin, more dilapidated than most I'd seen out here. The wood was splintered, and it looked like the place hadn't been inhabited in decades. "Odd place for a cabin," Rusty muttered, kicking at the woodpile by the door. "Not a lot of people know this far out. Might have been some trapper's place." I bent down to examine some marks on the ground. There were deep, irregular gouges in the dirt, like something had been dragged. My instincts were buzzing now, the kind of alert that creeps into your bones. We searched around inside the cabin, finding the usual: broken glass, rat droppings, a few rusted cans. But in the corner, almost hidden by debris, was something chilling. A ripped, blood-stained backpack. My heart sank. It matched the description of one of the missing hikers' packs. Rusty's face turned serious. "This ain't right, Darren. Not at all." He wasn't kidding. The blood looked fresh, smeared across the fabric, and there were claw marks on the pack that looked too sharp and too precise to belong to any animal I could name. That night, we stayed up in shifts, one of us always keeping an eye on the surroundings. We hadn't found any more signs of the hikers, but there was no way we were leaving after that discovery. Around midnight during my shift, I heard something rustling outside. Not the usual soft breeze or a fox sneaking by. This was heavier, slower, almost intentional. I gripped my flashlight and leaned out of the tent, shining it across the clearing. It was back, the creature from before. Only now it was closer, and the details were even more disturbing. Its fur seemed matted and uneven, patches missing, exposing skin that looked raw and unnatural. Its limbs were long and thin, like it had been stretched out of proportion. This time, it was dragging something, a limp form, unmistakably human, by the arm. I couldn't tear my eyes away, but I forced myself to move, my hand shooting to my radio to wake Rusty. Before I could say a word, the creature lifted its head, almost like it knew I was watching, and tilted it in the most unsettling way. Its head twisted too far, an unnatural angle that no creature should be able to achieve. Rusty woke up and scrambled out of the tent, his face turning a shade paler as he saw the scene in front of him. He didn't have to say anything. The fear in his eyes was answer enough. We both stood there frozen, watching as the thing dropped the body and slinked back into the darkness, its form shifting and melding with the shadows until it was gone. We didn't speak much after that, both of us lost in our thoughts. Come morning, the body was still there, but it wasn't recognizable anymore. It had been torn up, shredded in a way that wasn't natural, like the thing had dissected it for its own curiosity rather than out of hunger. Rusty shook his head and muttered a few choice curses under his breath. "We need to get out of here," he said, a rare tremor in his voice. Rusty, who could laugh off most things, looked genuinely shaken. We'd made up our minds to leave and report everything to the higher-ups when something new caught my eye. Off to the side, by the tree line, was another set of claw marks, deeper this time. But they weren't just random. They almost looked deliberate, like symbols or some twisted kind of writing carved into the bark. They seemed to be some kind of warning or territorial claim, though what the creature was trying to communicate, I had no idea. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't want us here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Rusty gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Great, now we're trespassing on cryptid turf. Guess that's a new one for the resume." We started down the trail as fast as we could manage. The unease only grew as we went, the feeling that we were being followed clinging to us like a shadow. Occasionally I'd look back, catching fleeting glimpses of movement between the trees. It never showed itself fully, but it was there, taunting us. As we finally reached the parking area, Rusty climbed into his truck and slammed the door. I barely had the presence of mind to do the same, my mind still replaying every surreal moment of the past 24 hours. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, something crashed against the side of the truck. Rusty yelped, and I looked over to see that clawed hand, or what passed for one, smearing blood across the window. It was as if the creature was marking us, leaving one final grotesque reminder of its presence. We sped out of there, not slowing down until the ranger station was in sight. I could still see those claw marks in my mind, like twisted symbols mocking us. As I filed the report, I left out the part about the thing's body language, the way it seemed too knowing, too human, almost. No one would believe me if I said it moved like it was mimicking something, like it understood more than it should. Rusty went back to Anchorage and kept his mouth shut, but I stayed around, doing a little research on the park's history. Turns out there were a few scattered legends about shapeshifters or creatures that mimicked human traits, using them to lure in prey.